December 17th, 1941, 10 days after Pearl Harbor. Lytle S. Adams, a Pennsylvania dentist, drove through the New Mexico desert, returning from vacation. He was furious. Like millions of Americans, he'd heard the news about the surprise attack. Like millions of Americans, he wanted revenge. Unlike millions of Americans, Adams had just visited Carlsbad Caverns and witnessed something that gave him an idea. An idea so bizarre, so audacious, so utterly insane that it would eventually reach the desk of President Franklin Roosevelt. An idea that would consume $2 million, involve dozens of scientists and engineers, successfully pass multiple military tests, and come closer to deployment than most Americans realize. Adams wanted to weaponize bats, millions of them, each carrying a tiny incendiary device, released over Japanese cities at dawn, an airborne army of flying mammals that would roost in the wooden buildings that comprised most of Japanese urban architecture, then simultaneously set thousands of fires that would overwhelm any fire department, destroy military production, and terrorize the civilian population. This wasn't the rambling of a madman. This was Project X-Ray, a serious military program funded by the National Defense Research Committee, tested by the Army Air Forces, evaluated by the Navy, and deemed tactically viable by multiple branches of the American military. The Japanese never knew that before the atomic bomb, before the massive firebombing campaigns, before Curtis LeMay's B-29 raids that would kill hundreds of thousands, America had developed a weapon that military analysts believed would be more effective than conventional incendiary bombing. A weapon that would use nature itself as the delivery system. A weapon that accidentally burned down an American military base during testing because it worked too well. This is the story of the bat bomb, the most bizarre, serious weapon ever developed by American military. A weapon that sounds like rejected script from a bad movie but was real, functional, and genuinely terrifying in its potential effectiveness. The story begins not with military strategists or weapons designers, but with a dentist on vacation who'd just seen something remarkable. Carlsbad Caverns, New Mexico, December 1941. Lytle Adams stood in the massive underground chamber, awestruck by the spectacle. Every evening at dusk, millions of Mexican free-tailed bats emerged from the cavern in a swirling tornado of wings and high-pitched squeaks. The exodus lasted for hours, wave after wave of bats spiraling upward into the desert sky, dispersing across hundreds of square miles to feed on insects. Adams learned from the park ranger that Mexican free-tailed bats could carry more than their own body weight in flight. They navigated perfectly in darkness. They could fly for hours without tiring. And, most importantly for what Adams was conceptualizing, they had an instinct to seek shelter at dawn, roosting in any available crevice, crack, or protected space. The idea crystallized as Adams drove home. Japanese cities were primarily constructed of wood and paper. Buildings were tightly packed with minimal fire breaks. A single incendiary bomb could start a fire, but thousands of simultaneous small fires spread across an entire city would be unstoppable. Traditional bombing required aircraft to reach targets, navigate anti-aircraft fire, and accurately drop bombs from high altitude. It was inefficient and dangerous, but what if you didn't need accuracy? What if the weapons distributed themselves? Release millions of bats over a Japanese city just before dawn, each bat carrying a tiny incendiary device with a time delay fuse. The bats would do what bats naturally do: seek shelter in buildings, roosting in attics, eaves, crawl spaces. When the incendiaries ignited simultaneously, thousands of fires would start in the most flammable parts of structures. Fire departments couldn't respond to thousands of separate fires. the city would burn. Adams wasn't just a dentist with a crazy idea. He was an inventor who held patents, a businessman with connections, and friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. He wrote a detailed proposal and sent it to the White House. Most such proposals would have been dismissed immediately. Adams' proposal reached the president's desk because Eleanor Roosevelt forwarded it, with a note suggesting it deserved serious consideration. Franklin Roosevelt read the proposal. Instead of dismissing it as lunacy, he forwarded it to William Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services, with a handwritten note. This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but is worth looking into. That presidential endorsement changed everything. Adams' bat bomb proposal entered the military bureaucracy, not as a crank letter, but as an idea requiring evaluation by the National Defense Research Committee. The NDRC was the scientific body responsible for evaluating unconventional weapons proposals. It had already funded radar development, proximity fuses, and early atomic research. Its scientists were accustomed to evaluating unusual ideas, but weaponized bats tested even their open-mindedness. Dr. Louis Fieser, a Harvard chemist who developed napalm, was assigned to evaluate the bat bomb concept. Fieser was initially skeptical, but as he studied Japanese urban construction, bat biology, and the mathematics of distributed incendiary attacks, his skepticism transformed into enthusiasm. The more he analyzed it, the more tactically sound it appeared. Japanese cities were uniquely vulnerable to incendiary attack. Wood and paper construction, tightly packed buildings, limited firefighting capacity, cultural factors that meant civilians might not evacuate quickly. A distributed incendiary attack using bats as delivery systems could be devastating. Fieser recommended full feasibility study. The NDRC allocated initial funding. Project X-ray officially began in March 1943. Adams became a civilian consultant with access to military resources. His first task: demonstrate that bats could be captured, handled, transported, and induced to carry small devices without dying or becoming useless. Adams assembled a team that included biologists, veterinarians, engineers, and military liaisons. They began by studying Mexican free-tailed bats in detail: biology, flight characteristics, carrying capacity, roosting behavior, hibernation patterns, everything that might matter for weaponization. Mexican free-tailed bats, scientific name Tatarita brasiliensis, proved ideal for multiple reasons. They were abundant. Colonies in the American Southwest numbered in the millions. They were small, weighing less than half an ounce, but could carry payloads exceeding their body weight. They were hardy, surviving temperature extremes, and critically for what Adams was conceptualizing, they had an instinct to seek shelter at dawn, roosting in any available crevice, crack, or protected space. The team needed to answer fundamental questions. Could bats be collected in sufficient numbers without harming them? Yes. Biologists developed netting systems that could capture thousands per night at places like Carlsbad Caverns and Bracken Cave in Texas. Could bats be induced into hibernation for transport? Yes. By gradually lowering temperature, bats entered torpor, a hibernation-like state where they could survive weeks without food or water. Could hibernating bats be awakened reliably? Yes. Gradually warming them triggered emergence from torpor within hours. Could bats carry artificial payloads? This required more testing. Engineers designed small harnesses, surgical clips that attached to the loose skin on a bat's chest without injuring the animal. The clips could hold small containers. Tests showed bats could fly normally while carrying objects up to 17 grams, roughly half their body weight. Now the team needed an incendiary device small enough for a bat to carry, but powerful enough to start a serious fire. Dr. Fieser's team at Harvard began designing what would become the most miniaturized incendiary device ever created. The requirements were severe: weigh less than 17 grams including container, fuse, and incendiary compound, burn hot enough to ignite wood, feature a time delay mechanism that prevented ignition during bat flight but triggered after bats had roosted, be stable enough to survive handling, transport, and the chaos of military logistics. Pfizer experimented with different incendiary compounds. Standard thermite was too heavy, white phosphorus was too unstable, napalm was too bulky. He eventually developed a compound he called bat bomb gel, a mixture of kerosene and other chemicals that burned intensely at 1800 degrees Fahrenheit for 8 minutes. The container was a small celluloid case weighing less than a gram. The time delay mechanism was elegantly simple, a spring-loaded striker held in place by a thin wire. The wire was coated with a chemical that dissolved slowly when exposed to air. After 30 minutes, the wire dissolved completely, the spring released, the striker hit a percussion cap, and the incendiary ignited. The complete package, harness, clip, container, incendiary, and fuse, weighed 16 grams, well within the bat's carrying capacity. By summer 1943, Project X-ray had demonstrated proof of concept for every component. Bats could be collected. They could be transported in hibernation. They could be awakened. They could carry incendiary devices. The devices would ignite reliably after time delay. Now they needed to test the complete system. The Army Air Forces designated Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Field as the primary testing location. It was remote, near a major bat population, and had facilities for constructing test targets. Engineers built replicas of Japanese buildings using authentic construction techniques, wood-frame structures with paper walls, tightly spaced with minimal separation. The goal was to recreate Japanese urban density in the New Mexico desert. Test 1 took place in May 1943. 5,000 bats were collected, fitted with dummy payloads, same weight as incendiaries but inert, placed in refrigerated containers, loaded onto a bomber, and released at 5,000 feet altitude just before dawn over the test village. The results were disappointing. Many bats, stressed by the collection and handling process, were too disoriented to fly properly. Some landed immediately, others flew erratically. The distribution was poor. Of 5,000 bats released, only about 40% successfully found roosting spots in the target structures. Project X-ray team analyzed the failures. The problem wasn't the bats, it was the release method. Bats dropped from bombers and standard crates experienced too much shock. They needed a gentler release mechanism. Engineers designed special bomb casings with compartments. Each casing held 40 hibernating bats in individual slots. The casing would be dropped from a bomber with a parachute. At 1,000 feet altitude, the casing would open automatically, exposing the bats to warming air. The bats would wake gradually, emerge from their slots, and fly away seeking shelter. This bat bomb casing was a marvel of specialized engineering. It had to protect hibernating bats during the fall, maintain low temperature until the right altitude, then release bats in a way that didn't injure them, but also ensured they dispersed properly. Test 2, July 1943, used the new casings. 10,000 bats, 25 improved bat bomb casings, released over an expanded test village. This test was dramatically more successful. Over 70% of bats successfully roosted in target structures. When observers inspected the buildings after the scheduled incendiary ignition time, using dummy devices that produce smoke but no fire, they found bats roosted throughout the structures, in attics, under eaves, in wall spaces, exactly where an incendiary device would cause maximum damage. The Navy expressed interest. Naval officers observed the July test and requested their own evaluation. They wanted to know if bat bombs could be used against Japanese shipping and port facilities. In August 1943, the Navy took over Project X-ray from the Army Air Forces. The program moved to a new testing facility at the Marine base at El Centro, California. The Navy brought additional funding and a sense of urgency. This is where the story takes its most famous turn. This is where Project X-ray accidentally demonstrated its effectiveness in the most dramatic way possible. August 1943. El Centro, California. The Navy constructed an even more elaborate test facility. Full-scale replicas of Japanese buildings, a mock-up of a Japanese tanker's interior, multiple observation posts, fire suppression equipment standing by. Test 3 was scheduled with full incendiary devices, live bat bombs with actual ignition capability. 6,000 bats, 30 bat bomb casings, each bat carrying a functioning 16-gram incendiary set to ignite 30 minutes after the casing opened. The test was planned meticulously. Release the casings at dawn, bats would disperse and roost. 30 minutes later, incendiaries would ignite. Observers would document fire start locations, spread rates, and suppression difficulty. Fire crews would then extinguish everything before serious damage occurred. The plan failed to account for one factor. Bats don't always cooperate. Some bats released from the casings didn't fly to the target village. They flew to the nearest shelter they could find, which happened to be hangars, barracks, and office buildings at the Army Airfield Auxiliary Field adjacent to the test site. 30 minutes after release, incendiaries began igniting. Not just in the test village, throughout the military installation. A wooden hangar caught fire first. The structure was 100 feet long, used for aircraft maintenance. It contained tools, fuel, lubricants, spare parts. Within minutes, the entire hangar was engulfed in fire. Fire crews rushed to respond, but were immediately diverted by new fires. A barracks building, fortunately empty during the test, erupted in flames. Then another. Then a fuel storage building. Within 20 minutes, multiple structures across the base were burning simultaneously. The base fire department was overwhelmed. They called for mutual aid from El Centro City Fire Department, but city firefighters faced the same problem military firefighters discovered. The fires were too numerous and too dispersed. Responding to one fire meant leaving others to grow unchecked. By the time the fires were controlled, several hours later, substantial portions of the auxiliary airfield had been destroyed. The damage ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars. A general staff car was incinerated. Ironically, the official test village, the intended target, suffered minimal damage because most bats had bypassed it for the nearby actual buildings. The base commander was furious. There were demands for court-martial, questions about who authorized live incendiaries near active facilities, accusations of criminal negligence. But the military observers drew a different conclusion. The bat bomb worked, spectacularly, devastatingly, exactly as designed.
The bats had distributed themselves throughout a built environment, roosted in the most flammable locations, and started fires that spread faster than any fire department could counter. The fact that they'd burned down the wrong buildings didn't matter. In combat, all of Japan's buildings were legitimate targets. Dr. Fieser wrote in his report, "The test was a success. The bat incendiary device functioned as designed. Fire spread exceeded our most optimistic projections. The distribution pattern suggests that a deployment of 1 million bats over a Japanese city would start between 3,000 and 5,000 simultaneous fires. No firefighting capability could respond effectively to such an attack." The accidental burning of the American base became the strongest evidence for the bat bomb's effectiveness. Navy leadership, instead of canceling the program, increased funding and accelerated development. By autumn 1943, Project X-ray had proven every element of the concept. Bats could be collected in sufficient numbers. They could be transported in hibernation. They could be loaded into special bomb casings. The casings could be dropped from aircraft. Bats would wake, disperse, and roost in buildings. Incendiaries would ignite reliably. Fires would start in optimal locations for maximum spread. Fire departments would be overwhelmed. The Navy ordered preparation for full-scale operational deployment. Ocean duty would begin in mid-1944. Target: Japanese home islands. But Project X-ray faced complications beyond engineering challenges. The first problem was scale. Early plans called for attacks using 1 million bats. Where would the military obtain 1 million bats? How would they be collected without depleting wild populations to extinction? Biologists surveyed major bat colonies across the American Southwest. Carlsbad Caverns held an estimated 5 million Mexican free-tailed bats. Bracken Cave in Texas held 10 million. Smaller colonies added millions more. The total population was sufficient, barely. But collecting 1 million bats would require massive operations and significant time. The collection problem got worse when biologists explained seasonal constraints. Mexican free-tailed bats migrated. They were only present in the American Southwest during specific months. They hibernated during winter. They gave birth in late spring, and disturbing maternity colonies would devastate populations. The window for collection was narrow, roughly August through October. Even within that window, collection was difficult. Bats had to be captured without injury. They had to be immediately placed in refrigerated hibernation. They had to be transported to holding facilities. They had to be maintained in hibernation until deployment, which might be months later. The logistics were staggering. Engineers calculated that collecting, processing, and preparing 1 million bats for a single attack would require 18 months of continuous operations. Multiple collection teams working simultaneously at different bat colonies, purpose-built refrigerated holding facilities, a supply chain for food, water, and veterinary care, transport aircraft, specialized handling equipment. The military had landed armies on foreign beaches, built aircraft carriers, and operated supply lines across oceans. But organizing a 1 million bat bombing campaign proved uniquely challenging. The second problem was weather and timing. Bats couldn't be released in rain. Wet bats can't fly effectively. They couldn't be released in high winds. Dispersal would be too unpredictable. They couldn't be released in cold weather. They'd remain torpid. The optimal conditions were specific: calm, dry, warm, just before dawn. Japan's climate made this difficult. The rainy season would eliminate June and July. Typhoon season threatened August and September. Winter cold ruled out December through March. The operational window narrowed to April, May, and October, assuming good weather on the specific attack date. The third problem was strategic targeting. Which Japanese cities should be attacked first? Military analysts studied Japanese urban geography, identifying cities that were both strategically important and maximally vulnerable to incendiary attack. The analysis showed that virtually every major Japanese city was vulnerable. Traditional Japanese architecture used wood frame construction with paper screens. Even modern buildings incorporated flammable materials. City planning emphasized density over fire breaks. Fire departments were under-equipped compared to American standards. Cultural factors meant civilians often tried to save property rather than evacuate quickly. The analysts created target lists ranking cities by strategic value and vulnerability. Tokyo topped the list. The capital, largest city, administrative center, and home to significant military production. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama followed. Secondary targets included Kyoto, Kure, Hiroshima, and dozens of smaller cities. But there was uncomfortable awareness that bat bomb attacks would cause massive civilian casualties. This wasn't bombing military factories, this was starting fires in residential neighborhoods because that's where bats would naturally roost. The distinction between military and civilian targets would be obliterated. Some officers expressed concerns about the ethics of bat bomb attacks. Were they consistent with international law? The Hague Conventions prohibited weapons that caused unnecessary suffering. Did weaponized bats qualify? The military's legal analysis concluded that bat bombs were no different than any other incendiary weapon. The Geneva Conventions didn't prohibit incendiary attacks. The bats themselves weren't the weapon, they were merely the delivery system for incendiaries. If dropping incendiary bombs from aircraft was legal, using bats to deliver the same devices should be equally legal. This reasoning satisfied military lawyers but didn't address deeper ethical questions. Conventional bombing at least involved human decisions about targeting. Bat bombs would start fires wherever bats happened to roost, primarily in residential areas where people lived, worked, and slept. Admiral Nimitz reviewed the program in late 1943. Nimitz was impressed by the technical achievement but troubled by the strategic implications. He raised practical concerns. Were bat bombs more effective than conventional incendiary attacks? Would they justify the enormous logistical requirements? The Navy's Operational Analysis Division ran comparative studies. A conventional B-29 raid carrying incendiary bombs could drop several tons of ordnance on a target. A bat bomb raid using 1 million bats would deliver 16 tons of incendiary material, seemingly more. But distribution mattered more than quantity. Conventional incendiaries landed in concentrated areas, wherever bombs happened to hit. Fire departments could prioritize. Fire breaks might contain spread. But bat bomb incendiaries would be distributed throughout the target city in thousands of separate locations. Every attic, every eave, every crawl space with a roosting bat would become an ignition point. Fire departments couldn't even map the fires, let alone respond to them all. The analysis concluded that a 1 million bat raid would cause more comprehensive damage than a conventional raid using 3 times the incendiary tonnage. The bat bombs were genuinely more effective. This energized the program. The Navy accelerated preparations for operational deployment, but they faced competition from an unexpected source. Curtis LeMay's B-29 program was simultaneously developing conventional incendiary bombing tactics. By early 1944, B-29 superfortresses were being deployed to the Pacific. LeMay was developing low-altitude nighttime firebombing strategies that would ultimately kill hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. LeMay's approach was brutal but simple. Fill B-29s with incendiary bombs, fly at night below radar detection, drop everything on Japanese cities, then leave before fighters could intercept. No precision targeting, just area saturation with incendiaries. The military had to choose: invest in bat bombs or conventional firebombing. Both would kill massive numbers of civilians. Both would destroy Japanese cities. But conventional firebombing was operationally simpler. It didn't require collecting millions of bats. It didn't depend on weather conditions. It didn't involve untested biological delivery systems.
By spring 1944, Project X-ray faced institutional resistance from the Army Air Forces, which preferred conventional bombing, and budgetary competition from other programs, including a highly classified project in New Mexico that would eventually produce atomic bombs. Then the decisive factor appeared. The Manhattan Project was accelerating toward viable atomic weapons. Military leadership began realizing that atomic bombs might end the war before any exotic weapons like bat bombs could be deployed. Admiral Ernest King reviewed Project X-ray in May 1944. King appreciated the technical brilliance, but questioned whether the military should invest further resources in a weapon that might never be used. He recommended transitioning the project to low-priority research status, military bureaucracy's way of slowly canceling something without officially killing it. The Navy stopped funding field tests. The elaborate facilities at Centro were mothballed. The specialized bat bomb casings were put in storage. The refrigerated bat-holding facilities were decommissioned. Collection operations ceased. The biologists, veterinarians, and engineers were reassigned to other projects. Project X-ray didn't officially end. It faded. There was no formal cancellation order, no final report declaring success or failure. It simply stopped receiving attention, funding, and priority. By late 1944, when Curtis LeMay began his devastating firebombing campaign against Japanese cities, the bat bombs were forgotten. Lytle S, the dentist who'd started it all, protested the program's termination. He argued that bat bombs were more effective and more humane than conventional firebombing. His logic was strange but sincere. Bat bomb fires would be distributed throughout a city, giving civilians time to evacuate. Conventional bombing dropped massive tonnages in concentrated areas, creating firestorms that killed instantly. Adams believed that if the military had deployed bat bombs instead of conducting conventional fire raids, fewer Japanese civilians would have died. He was probably wrong. Distributed fires might actually be deadlier because evacuation routes would be cut off from multiple directions. But Adams genuinely believed his invention could be a more merciful weapon. No one in military leadership took Adams' protests seriously. By 1945, the military was preparing for potential invasion of Japan. Atomic bombs were nearing completion. Bat bombs were a curiosity, an interesting experiment, but no longer relevant. Then, in August 1945, the war ended suddenly. Hiroshima and Nagasaki proved that atomic weapons made conventional invasion unnecessary. Project X-ray's files were classified and archived. The project remained largely unknown to the public for decades. But the story doesn't end with the war. Post-war analysis of Project X-ray revealed just how close the bat bombs came to operational deployment. Documents declassified in the 1990s showed that the Navy had approved full-scale production of bat bomb casings. Contracts had been signed for manufacturing 1 million units. Collection operations were scheduled to begin in August 1944. The first combat deployment was planned for January 1945. The atomic bomb essentially saved the bat bomb from being used. Had the Manhattan Project failed or been delayed, bat bombs would have been deployed on Japan in early 1945, months before the firebombing campaigns reached their peak intensity. Military analysts who studied Project X-ray after the war reached surprising conclusions about its potential effectiveness. A 1947 analysis by the Strategic Bombing Survey suggested that bat bomb raids might have been devastatingly effective against Japanese urban areas. The report calculated that a sustained campaign using bat bombs, 10 million bats deployed over 50 major Japanese cities, would have caused more structural destruction than the actual firebombing campaigns conducted by LeMay's B-29 force. The reasoning was mathematical. Conventional bombing, even area bombing, produced concentrated damage. Firebombing Tokyo on March 9–10, 1945 killed over 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. But that required 334 bombers dropping 1,665 tons of incendiaries. A bat bomb raid using 1 million bats would distribute 16 tons of incendiaries throughout a much larger area. The fires would be less intense, but more comprehensive. More of the city would burn, even if fewer people died immediately. The report concluded, quote, "Bat incendiary bombs would have presented Japanese fire departments with an impossible challenge. Conventional bombing could be prepared for, shelters, fire breaks, evacuation plans, but thousands of simultaneous small fires starting randomly throughout a city would overwhelm any response capability." This conclusion raised uncomfortable questions. If bat bombs were more effective than conventional firebombing, and if they'd been ready for deployment, would the military have used them? Would ethical concerns about weaponizing animals have prevented deployment, or would military necessity have overcome such scruples? The answer is probably that bat bombs would have been used without hesitation. By 1945, the American military was willing to do almost anything to avoid invading Japan. Firebombing cities, atomic bombs, starving the population through naval blockade. Using weaponized bats would have been uncontroversial compared to these options. Japanese officials interviewed after the war were asked about bat bombs. Most had never heard of the program. It remained classified throughout the war. When told about Project X-ray, the reactions were consistent: horror at the concept, but acknowledgement that it would have been effective. One Japanese civil defense official, when shown photographs of the Centro test, said, "Our cities would have been helpless. We had trained civilians to respond to conventional bombing, take shelter, then fight fires afterward. But thousands of simultaneous small fires starting randomly throughout a city? We had no preparation for this. The fires would have spread unchecked. Entire cities would have burned. This official's assessment matched what happened during the actual firebombing campaigns. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe all burned extensively despite Japanese preparations. Bat bombs would have achieved similar or greater destruction with fewer aircraft and less tonnage of ordnance. But there's a strange footnote to the bat bomb story. The incendiary technology developed for Project X-ray didn't go to waste. Dr. Fieser's 16-gram incendiary device was remarkably advanced. It burned hotter and longer than anything comparable at that size. After Project X-ray ended, Fieser's incendiary research continued. He developed larger versions for conventional use. His incendiary compounds were incorporated into the M69 incendiary cluster bomb, the primary weapon used in the firebombing of Tokyo and other Japanese cities. So while bat bombs were never deployed, the technology developed for them ended up killing hundreds of thousands of people anyway. The irony is bitter. The bat bomb program was canceled to save resources, but the incendiary research it funded made conventional firebombing more effective, resulting in greater civilian casualties than bat bombs probably would have caused. There's also scientific legacy. The biological research conducted for Project X-ray advanced understanding of bat ecology, physiology, and behavior. Biologists learned how to capture, transport, and maintain bats in ways that became valuable for conservation research decades later. When white-nose syndrome threatened North American bat populations in the 2000s, some techniques for safely handling large bat populations traced back to Project X-ray research. The engineering innovations had lasting impact too. The bat bomb casings required solving problems in timed release mechanisms, parachute deployment, and precision manufacturing. Engineers involved in Project X-ray carried those skills to post-war industries. Some worked on early guided missile programs. Others applied lessons about distributed delivery systems to agricultural spraying and forest fire suppression technologies. But perhaps the most important legacy is ethical. Project X-ray represents an extreme case of how far democratic governments will go during existential conflict. Americans like to think of themselves as moral people fighting just wars. But Project X-ray showed that when sufficiently threatened, democratic nations will seriously develop weapons as ethically questionable as any totalitarian regime might create. Weaponizing animals isn't unprecedented. Militaries throughout history have used horses, dogs, pigeons, and other animals. But deliberately designing a weapon system that exploits animal behavior to cause mass civilian casualties crosses a line that makes most people uncomfortable, even when they understand the military logic. If you'd asked Americans in 1944 whether their country should develop weapons using animals to burn Japanese civilians alive, most would have said no. But if you'd asked whether they wanted the war won quickly with minimal American casualties, most would have said yes. Project X-ray resolved this tension by making the weapons development classified. The public never had to confront the moral implications until decades after the war ended. This pattern repeated with other morally questionable programs: atomic bomb development, biological weapons research, human radiation experiments. Democratic oversight works only when the public knows what their government is doing. Project X-ray operated in secrecy, funded with limited congressional knowledge, answerable only to military leadership. The bat bomb also reveals how war normalizes the abnormal. When Project X-ray began, many military officers thought it was absurd. By 1944, after extensive testing and analysis, those same officers were planning bat bomb production in the millions. What seemed insane in 1942 seemed reasonable by 1944. War has a way of making the unthinkable become routine. We can see this progression in the documents. Early reports about Project X-ray are tentative, almost embarrassed to take the concept seriously. By late 1943, reports are matter-of-fact, discussing bat bomb raids with the same tone used for conventional bombing operations. The language shift from experimental concept to viable weapon system to operational capability. What changed wasn't the weapon, it was the people evaluating it becoming acclimated to its strangeness. There's parallel with atomic bomb development. Early Manhattan Project scientists had moral qualms about creating weapons of mass destruction. By 1945, those qualms had faded. The weapon became normalized through familiarity and military necessity. Bat bombs followed the same psychological trajectory, just without reaching actual deployment. Today, Project X-ray is primarily remembered as a historical curiosity. It appears in lists of weird weapons of World War II, along with other unusual programs like pigeon-guided missiles, acoustic kitty spy cats, and earthquake bombs. The tone is usually humorous. Look at this crazy thing the military tried. But Project X-ray deserves more serious consideration. It was a legitimate weapon system that underwent rigorous testing and came remarkably close to deployment. It would have worked. It might have been more effective than the weapons actually used. And it reveals uncomfortable truths about how democracies conduct total war. The people involved in Project X-ray weren't monsters or madmen. They were dentists and scientists and engineers and military officers trying to win a war against an enemy that had attacked without warning. They saw weaponized bats not as cruel or absurd, but as an innovative solution to a strategic problem. They genuinely believed they were helping end the war faster and save American lives.
This ordinariness is what makes Project X-ray significant. It's easy to condemn obviously evil actions by obviously evil people. It's harder to confront how ordinary people, working within normal institutions using scientific methods, can develop weapons that in peacetime would seem unconscionable. Would modern America develop bat bombs? Probably not. Current military capabilities make such weapons unnecessary, and modern environmental regulations would prevent large-scale bat collection. But would modern America develop something equally controversial if faced with existential threat? The answer is certainly yes. Every generation believes it's more moral than previous generations, but circumstances matter more than values. Given sufficient threat and sufficient time, any nation will develop whatever weapons seem necessary. The bat bomb isn't an aberration in American history. It's a window into what any democratic nation becomes during total war. The Japanese cities that were targeted for bat bomb attacks ended up burning anyway. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all were devastated by conventional firebombing. Hundreds of thousands died. The bat bombs might have caused less immediate death while destroying more infrastructure. Or they might have caused equivalent casualties while requiring fewer bombers. The counterfactual is unknowable. What is known is that Project X-ray worked. The tests succeeded. The weapon was viable. The deployment was planned. Only the atomic bomb prevented its use. In an alternate history where Manhattan Project failed, bat bombs would have been used extensively against Japan in 1945. In that alternate history, we'd remember WW2 differently. Instead of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the peak of wartime horror, we'd remember the night millions of bats descended on Tokyo carrying fire. We'd remember Japanese accounts of waking to thousands of simultaneous fires with no warning. We'd remember the moral debates about weaponizing nature itself. But we live in this history, where bat bombs were developed, tested, and then abandoned, where they burned down an American military base by accident, but never burned a Japanese city on purpose, where they remain a footnote in the history of unconventional weapons, remembered more for their strangeness than their significance. Lytle S died in 1970. He never stopped believing bat bombs were a more humane weapon than what was actually used. He gave occasional interviews about Project X-ray,
always insisting that if the military had listened to him, fewer civilians would have died. Whether he was right is debatable. What's certain is that he created something that worked far better than anyone expected, including him. The last surviving Project X-ray researcher died in 2006. With his death, the final direct connection to the program ended. What remains are documents, photographs, and the stories. And one partially burned building at what was El Centro Naval Facility, preserved as a peculiar memorial to the day that American bats accidentally attacked America. There's strange poetry in how Project X-ray ended. The program was canceled to save resources for the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb ended the war. But bat bombs demonstrated one fundamental truth that atomic bombs couldn't. The most terrifying weapons aren't always the most powerful ones. An atomic bomb is terrible but comprehensible. An explosion, a flash, destruction on massive scale but limited geography. You can understand an atomic bomb's horror intellectually. A bat bomb is different. It weaponizes nature. It turns familiar animals into instruments of destruction. It starts fires in places that shouldn't burn, attics, walls, spaces you can't see or reach. It creates thousands of simultaneous catastrophes. It's intimate and distributed rather than remote and concentrated. It's a violation of categories. Nature shouldn't be weaponized. Homes should be safe. Animals should be harmless. Perhaps that's why bat bombs disturb us more than conventional weapons. They cross boundaries we want to keep separate. They make nature itself into an enemy. They turn the mundane, bats emerging at dusk, into something terrifying. The Japanese never knew they came so close to facing this weapon. In post-war interviews, when Japanese civil defense officials were shown Project X-ray documentation and test footage, their reactions were remarkably consistent. Relief mixed with horror. Relief that it hadn't been used. Horror at how effective it would have been.
One elderly Japanese firefighter, interviewed in 1995 for a documentary about unconventional weapons, watched footage of the El Centro base burning. He had been a fire captain in Osaka during the war. He'd survived multiple conventional bombing raids. When asked how Japanese fire departments would have responded to bat bomb attacks, he was silent for a long moment before responding, "We couldn't have responded. In conventional raids, we knew fires would start where bombs fell. We could position crews, predict spread patterns, establish fire breaks. But thousands of fires starting simultaneously in attics throughout the city? We would have evacuated. There would have been nothing else to do. The cities would have burned completely." This assessment matches what actually happened during the conventional firebombing campaigns. When LeMay's B-29s dropped incendiaries on Tokyo in March 1945, the fires created a firestorm that consumed 16 square miles. Fire departments couldn't respond. The heat was too intense, the area too large, the destruction too rapid. But Tokyo's fire department had time to recognize the situation and order evacuation. They had warning when bombers approached. They knew roughly where fires would start. Bat bombs would have eliminated even that minimal preparation time. Fires would have started simultaneously throughout the city with no warning, no pattern, no way to predict or respond. The military analysts who calculated that bat bombs would be more effective than conventional bombing weren't being theoretical. They understood that distributed ignition points would cause more comprehensive destruction than concentrated incendiary drops, even if the total incendiary tonnage was lower. There's a grim mathematics to fire warfare. A single large fire can be fought, contained, or allowed to burn itself out in a defined area. But dozens of small fires quickly become unmanageable. Hundreds of fires mean fire departments must choose which neighborhoods to abandon. Thousands of fires mean the entire city is indefensible. Bat bombs would have created thousands of fires. That was their fundamental innovation, not in the incendiary technology, but in the distribution method. Modern military planners occasionally revisit Project X-ray concepts when thinking about distributed denial-of-service attacks, swarm tactics, and other approaches that overwhelm defenses through numbers rather than individual capability. The same logic applies whether you're talking about bats carrying incendiaries or drones carrying explosives or cyber attacks from multiple vectors simultaneously. The bat bomb pioneered distributed attack methodology. Each individual bat carried negligible payload. No single bat mattered, but millions of bats collectively delivered devastating capability. This was revolutionary thinking in 1943, when military doctrine emphasized concentrated force at decisive points. The Germans had demonstrated the opposite approach with V-2 rockets, massive individual weapons delivering concentrated destruction. Each V-2 carried 1 ton of explosives and cost enormous resources to produce and launch. A bat bomb raid using 1 million bats delivered 16 tons of incendiary, 16 times the destructive payload at a fraction of the cost, and with better target coverage. This cost-effectiveness analysis intrigued post-war military planners. The entire Project X-ray program cost approximately $2 million, equivalent to about $30 million in 2025 dollars. For that investment, the military developed a working weapon system capable of being mass-produced and deployed at scale. Compare this to other weapons programs. The Manhattan Project cost $2 billion in 1945 dollars. The B-29 bomber program cost $3 billion. Even conventional bomber development ran into hundreds of millions. Project X-ray was remarkably cheap for the capability it provided. Why was it so inexpensive? Because the delivery system was free. Bats existed in wild populations numbering hundreds of millions. They didn't need to be manufactured, trained, or maintained long-term. They just needed to be collected and kept alive long enough for deployment. Then they'd do what nature had programmed them to do: seek shelter at dawn. This exploitation of natural behavior was the genius of the bat bomb concept. Military weapons typically fight against physics, making objects fly faster, hit harder, explode more powerfully. The bat bomb worked with biology. It didn't need to alter bat behavior, just redirect it toward military purpose. Modern military ethicists studying Project X-ray documents struggle with how to categorize it. Is weaponizing animals fundamentally different than weaponizing inanimate objects? The bats weren't harmed by being used. Most would have survived the raids, flying away after roosting and eventually dropping the harnesses. But they were being used without choice, exploited for human warfare. Some ethicists argue this is no different than using horses in cavalry or dogs for military working purposes. Animals have always been part of warfare. The bat bomb was just a more creative application of the same principle. Others contend there's a meaningful distinction. Horses and dogs are domesticated animals with long military history. They're trained, cared for, and generally treated as valuable resources. Bats were wild animals being collected en masse, used once and released, assuming they survived. The relationship was purely extractive. The debate becomes more complex when considering that Project X-ray researchers went to great lengths to minimize harm to bats. Collection methods were designed to avoid injury. Hibernation transport was carefully controlled. The harnesses were engineered not to damage bat skin. Researchers genuinely cared about bat welfare within the constraints of weaponizing them. This creates an ethical paradox. The researchers wanted to kill Japanese civilians by burning their homes, but they didn't want to hurt the bats doing the burning. The moral calculus is strange. Enemy humans were legitimate targets. Wild bats required humane treatment. War creates these inversions of normal ethics. Dr. Vladimir Nabokov, the famous novelist, who was also a lepidopterist working at Harvard during the war, knew several Project X-ray researchers. He apparently found the whole program absurd and wrote a satirical poem about it, never published during his lifetime, that mocked the idea of scientists carefully protecting bats while simultaneously planning to burn cities. Nabokov's mockery missed the researchers' perspective. They weren't being hypocritical. They were following professional ethics. As biologists, they had obligations to minimize animal suffering. As Americans at war, they had obligations to help defeat Japan. They saw no contradiction between these duties. This compartmentalization characterizes much of Project X-ray. The dentist who proposed weaponizing bats was also an animal lover who supported wildlife conservation. The chemist who developed incendiary compounds was a pacifist who viewed his work as defensive, helping end the war faster. The Navy officers who approved bat bomb production were also men who'd likely be horrified by cruelty to animals in civilian contexts. War doesn't make people abandon their values. It creates parallel ethical frameworks where wartime necessity operates under different rules than peacetime morality. Project X-ray existed in the wartime framework where weaponizing nature was acceptable because the cause was just and the enemy was evil. But ethical frameworks have consequences that outlast wars. The technology developed for Project X-ray had impacts beyond the intended military use. Dr. Fieser's incendiary research contributed to weapons that killed hundreds of thousands. The biological research techniques pioneered for bat handling found use in both beneficial conservation work and potentially harmful animal experimentation. The broader impact was normalizing the idea that nature itself could be weaponized. After Project X-ray came serious proposals for earthquake weapons, tsunami bombs, weather modification for military advantage, and using disease-carrying insects. Most weren't pursued to operational status, but the conceptual barrier had been broken. Project X-ray showed that weaponizing biology was feasible, that biological systems could be studied, understood, and redirected toward military ends, that natural behaviors could become military assets. This opened doors that perhaps should have remained closed. In 1972, the Biological Weapons Convention was signed, prohibiting development of biological and toxin weapons. The treaty doesn't mention bat bombs specifically, but the general principle applies. Weaponizing biological systems is now internationally prohibited. Project X-ray probably wouldn't be legal under modern international law. But in 1943, no such restrictions existed. The rules of war were still relatively primitive regarding unconventional weapons. Chemical weapons had been banned after World War I horrors, but biological systems hadn't been seriously weaponized yet. Project X-ray operated in a regulatory vacuum where creative weapons development faced few legal constraints. This lack of oversight meant Project X-ray proceeded from concept to operational readiness with minimal external scrutiny. Military classification kept it secret. Congressional funding was buried in larger appropriations. The public had no idea their government was developing incendiary bats. This secrecy raises questions about democratic accountability during war. Should citizens have input on what weapons their military develops, or does military necessity require operating in secret? Project X-ray suggests democracies struggle with this tension, wanting both effective military capabilities and democratic oversight, but rarely achieving both simultaneously. The researchers working on Project X-ray didn't think of themselves as operating outside democratic norms. They saw themselves as serving democracy by helping win the war. They believed American citizens, if fully informed, would support their work. They were probably right. Public opinion in 1943 supported almost any measure that might shorten the war. But probably would have supported isn't the same as actually did support after being informed. The difference matters for democratic legitimacy. Project X-ray wasn't a conspiracy. It was a classified military program. But classification prevented democratic debate about whether weaponizing bats was something Americans wanted their government to do. This pattern repeats throughout the war. The atomic bomb was developed in extreme secrecy. Firebombing strategies were implemented without public discussion. Submarine warfare tactics that killed civilians were never debated openly.
democracy during total war looks remarkably undemocratic. Necessarily so, military leaders would argue. The military's case for secrecy was straightforward. If Japan learned about bat bombs, they might develop countermeasures, urban redesign, bat-proof construction, early warning systems. Secrecy provided tactical advantage, but secrecy also prevented democratic oversight of whether such weapons should be developed at all. In peacetime, citizens might reject weaponizing bats as unethical or absurd. In wartime, with secrecy preventing public knowledge, such weapons can be developed without democratic input. When they're eventually revealed, decades after the fact, it's too late for meaningful debate. This is exactly what happened with Project X-ray. The program remained classified until the 1990s, 50 years after the war ended. By then, everyone involved was dead or elderly. The ethical debates that should have happened in the 1940s happened in the 1990s when they were purely academic. The precedent had been set, the technology had been developed. The only question was historical interpretation. Modern scholars studying Project X-ray tend to focus on its absurdity, the sheer strangeness of weaponized bats. But the absurdity obscures more important questions. Project X-ray worked. It was cost-effective. It would have been devastatingly effective if deployed. The fact that it sounds ridiculous doesn't mean it was ridiculous. This disconnect between how something sounds and what it actually was characterizes many aspects of World War II unconventional weapons research. Pigeon-guided missiles sound absurd until you understand that pigeons' visual target recognition was actually superior to early electronic guidance systems. Acoustic kitty spy programs sound silly until you realize that animal surveillance could access places human agents couldn't. Project X-ray sounds like rejected script from a cartoon, but it was serious military science that came within months of operational deployment. The fact that it didn't get deployed wasn't because it was absurd, it was because atomic bombs proved more effective and became available sooner. In an alternate history where the Manhattan Project failed, bat bombs would have been used extensively. By late 1945, Japanese cities would have experienced attacks by millions of weaponized bats. The outcome would have been catastrophic, perhaps more catastrophic than what actually happened, since bat bomb raids could be sustained over months while atomic bombs were limited by production capacity. That alternate history helps clarify what Project X-ray actually was. Not a curiosity, not a failed experiment, not a ridiculous idea that proved impractical. Project X-ray was a viable weapon system that was displaced by an even more effective weapon, the atomic bomb.
Understanding this changes how we should think about the program. It wasn't absurd that it was developed. It was remarkably rational, given the circumstances. It wasn't surprising that it worked. It was surprising that it worked so well. It wasn't strange that military planners wanted to deploy it. It was strange that they never got the chance. The bat bomb represents roads not taken in military technology development. After atomic weapons, conventional bombing became obsolete for strategic purposes. The elaborate research into unconventional incendiary delivery systems like bat bombs became irrelevant. The future was nuclear weapons, guided missiles, and eventually precision strike capability. But imagine if atomic weapons hadn't been developed. Imagine if WW2 had continued into 1946, 1947, or beyond. In that timeline, weapons like bat bombs would have been refined, deployed extensively, and become standard military capabilities. We'd think of them not as bizarre curiosities, but as important strategic weapons, as normal as aircraft carriers or submarines. This thought experiment reveals that weapons technology development is contingent. What seems inevitable in hindsight was actually one path among many possible paths.
The atomic bomb seemed inevitable because it was developed first and rendered alternatives obsolete. But if development timelines had been different, we might live in a world where distributed biological weapons were normal and atomic weapons were the exotic curiosity. The researchers who worked on Project X-ray understood they were exploring genuinely novel military concepts. They weren't just building a weird weapon, they were pioneering distributed attack methodologies that challenged conventional thinking about force concentration. Post-war, some Project X-ray researchers continued working on distributed systems problems. Not bat bombs specifically, but the underlying concept of using large numbers of simple units to achieve effects that individual complex systems couldn't match. This thinking influenced early computer network design, agricultural pest control strategies, and eventually concepts like mesh networks and swarm intelligence. The intellectual legacy of Project X-ray extends beyond the specific application. The program demonstrated that sometimes the most effective approach isn't making individual units more powerful, but deploying vast numbers of simple units in coordinated ways. This principle now underlies many modern technologies. But we should be careful not to redeem Project X-ray through its intellectual legacy. The program was about killing people by burning their homes. Whatever scientific or engineering insights emerged, that was the core purpose. And it would have worked horrifically well. The Japanese civilians who would have died in bat bomb raids didn't die in those specific attacks only because atomic bombs ended the war first. Many died in conventional firebombing raids instead. The distinction between burning to death from bat-delivered incendiaries versus aircraft-delivered incendiaries is meaningless from the victim's perspective. This is perhaps the most important lesson of Project X-ray. The weapon's strangeness doesn't make it fundamentally different from conventional weapons. Fire kills the same way whether delivered by bats or bombers. The method of delivery affects military logistics and tactical effectiveness, but the moral questions remain constant. Is it ethical to conduct incendiary attacks on civilian populations? Project X-ray doesn't create this ethical problem, it just highlights it through unusual means. The real horror wasn't the weaponized bats. The real horror was the willingness to burn cities full of civilians to win a war. Americans in 1945 generally accepted this willingness as necessary. Japan had attacked without warning. Japanese military committed atrocities throughout Asia. American casualties in Pacific fighting were severe. The public supported almost any measure that might end the war and bring soldiers home. In that context, firebombing Japanese cities, whether by conventional bombers or weaponized bats, seemed justified. The ethical framework of total war said that destroying the enemy's ability and will to fight was legitimate, even if civilians died in the process. Modern ethical frameworks are less certain. We still accept that war sometimes requires killing civilians, collateral damage in military euphemism, but we also expect efforts to minimize civilian casualties, distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, and use proportionate force. By modern standards, extensive strategic bombing of civilian areas would be war crimes. But those standards developed partly because of World War II bombing campaigns. Before the war, there were few rules about strategic bombing because the capability barely existed. The war created the capability and the destruction, which then prompted development of new rules. Project X-ray existed before those rules. It was planned and tested in an ethical environment where burning enemy cities was acceptable military strategy. It was abandoned not because it was unethical, but because atomic bombs were more effective. This chronology matters. If Project X-ray had been proposed after international humanitarian law developed more fully, it probably would have been rejected as unacceptable. But in 1943, it was just another weapon system, stranger than most, but not fundamentally different in purpose or effect from conventional strategic bombing. The bat bomb story ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. The program faded away. The bats were released back to their caves. The specialized casings were eventually scrapped or lost. The refrigerated holding facilities were repurposed or demolished. The researchers moved on to other projects. Lytle S, the dentist who started it all, returned to his practice. He occasionally gave interviews about his bat bomb idea, usually treated as an amusing wartime anecdote. He died in relative obscurity, his most significant achievement unknown to most Americans. The base that accidentally burned during testing was rebuilt. No memorial was erected. No plaque explained what happened. For decades, even people working at the facility didn't know about the bat bomb test that had gone wrong. The Mexican free-tailed bats in Carlsbad Caverns continue their nightly exodus, unaware that their ancestors were once considered for military service. Millions of bats emerging at dusk, just as they have for millennia, just as they did in December 1941 when a visiting dentist had a terrible, brilliant idea. Project X-ray became a historical footnote, a curiosity, mentioned in books about unusual weapons, an occasional question in trivia contests, did you know fact shared on social media. The program that came within months of deployment that might have changed how we remember World War II, that accidentally proved its own effectiveness by burning down an American military base, reduced to an amusing anecdote about crazy wartime weapons programs. But for those who study Project X-ray in depth, the program represents something more significant than historical trivia. It represents the outer boundaries of what democracies will do during existential conflict. It represents the application of scientific rationality to objectives that seem irrational. It represents the ability of ordinary people to develop extraordinary weapons without seeing themselves as doing anything wrong. The bat bomb wasn't developed by monsters. It was developed by a dentist, chemists, biologists, veterinarians, engineers, and military officers. Regular people, smart people. People who loved animals and supported conservation and probably would have been horrified by animal cruelty in peacetime contexts. But war changes what seems normal. In wartime, weaponizing millions of bats to burn enemy cities became a reasonable project, something to be studied, refined, and prepared for operational deployment, something to be proud of, a clever solution to a difficult problem. This normalization of the abnormal is Project X-ray's most disturbing legacy, not the weapon itself, but what the weapon reveals about how war corrupts moral reasoning. Not the incendiary bats, but the fact that smart, decent people could work on incendiary bats without seeing themselves as doing anything ethically problematic. Project X-ray worked. It would have killed thousands of people. It would have destroyed cities. And everyone involved would have considered themselves heroes, helping to win the war and save American lives. They wouldn't have been wrong from their perspective. The war needed to be won. American lives needed to be saved. If weaponizing bats achieved those objectives, then weaponizing bats was justified. But justification depends on perspective. To Americans in 1944, bat bombs were clever innovation. To Japanese civilians who would have burned to death, bat bombs would have been nightmarish horror. Both perspectives are valid. Neither negates the other. This is the fundamental problem with weapons development. What seems like reasonable military innovation from one perspective appears as moral atrocity from another. The gap between these perspectives can't be fully bridged, not during the war, and often not even decades later when historians debate what happened and why. Project X-ray forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. If our government developed weaponized bats during World War II, what are they developing now? What programs exist in classified compartments, unknown to citizens, pursuing objectives we might find ethically troubling if we knew about them? The answer is certainly that such programs exist. Every major military invests in unconventional weapons research. Most of it remains classified. The public learns about these programs decades later, if ever. By then, it's too late for democratic input on whether such research should have occurred.
This isn't conspiracy theory, it's how classified military research programs work. They have to work in secrecy because adversaries must not learn about developing capabilities. But secrecy prevents democratic oversight. The tension is inherent and probably unresolvable. Project X-ray shows what happens in that tension. A weapon system is developed, tested, and prepared for use without public knowledge or debate. Only the accident of timing, atomic bombs becoming available sooner, prevented deployment. If timing had been different, Americans would have learned about bat bombs only after they'd been used to kill thousands of Japanese civilians. Would the public have objected? Probably not in 1945, but they should have had the opportunity to participate in the decision, or at least know it was being made. Democracy means citizens have say in what their government does. Wartime secrecy means citizens often don't learn what's being done in their name until far too late. This is the deepest lesson of Project X-ray. Not that bat bombs were bizarre, not that they almost got deployed, but that they were developed, tested, and nearly used without democratic input or oversight. And that this pattern of weapons being developed in secret and deployed without public debate continues today in programs we won't learn about for decades. The Bat Bomb project ended in 1944, but the questions it raises remain urgently relevant. In a democracy, who decides what weapons get developed? How do we balance military necessity against democratic accountability? When does secrecy serve national security, and when does it prevent legitimate democratic oversight? These questions have no easy answers, but they deserve more attention than they typically receive. Project X-ray, in its bizarre specificity, makes these abstract questions concrete. Weaponized bats sound absurd, but they were real. They worked. They almost burned Japanese cities. If that could happen, if something that sounds that ridiculous could come that close to deployment, what else might be happening now? What other unconventional weapons programs exist in classified development? What will we learn about 30 or 50 years from now when current programs are eventually declassified? The bat bomb may be history, but the pattern it represents is present and future. The Japanese never knew. They never knew that before the atomic bomb, before the massive B-29 raids, before Curtis LeMay's firebombing campaign that killed hundreds of thousands, America had developed something stranger and potentially more devastating. An army of millions of bats, each carrying fire, each following natural instincts to roost in the most flammable parts of Japanese buildings. Project X-ray worked. The tests succeeded. The weapon was viable. Military planners prepared for operational deployment. In January 1945, the first bat bomb raids were scheduled to hit Japanese cities. Only the atomic bomb prevented it. The Manhattan Project succeeded sooner than anyone expected, rendering bat bombs obsolete before they were ever used. But for those few months in 1944, America was seriously planning to attack Japan using weaponized bats. And it would have worked. Devastatingly. The American base that accidentally burned proved the concept more effectively than any planned demonstration could have. Dr. Pfizer was right in his assessment. No firefighting capability could respond effectively to thousands of simultaneous fires started by bat-delivered incendiaries. The Japanese were uniquely vulnerable. Wooden cities, paper walls, tightly packed buildings. Bat bombs would have been catastrophic. The weapon that sounds too ridiculous to be real was real. The weapon that seems too bizarre to work worked spectacularly. The weapon that appears to be historical curiosity came within months of killing thousands of people. Project X-ray reminds us that war drives innovation in directions that peacetime rationality would never pursue.
A dentist observing bats became a weapons developer. Chemists studying mold created incendiaries. Biologists researching animal behavior enabled strategic bombing. Engineers solving delivery problems designed bat bomb casings. All of them ordinary people doing extraordinary work. All of them convinced they were helping win the war and save American lives. None of them seeing themselves as developing weapons of questionable ethics. This is perhaps the most important lesson. The bat bomb wasn't developed by evil people pursuing evil ends. It was developed by regular people pursuing what seemed like reasonable objectives in wartime context. If we want to understand what nations do during war, what weapons they develop, what tactics they employ, what ethical boundaries they cross, Project X-ray provides a case study. It shows how rational scientific methods can be applied to objectives that seem irrational. How ordinary institutional processes can produce extraordinary outcomes. How democratic societies can develop weapons in secret without democratic oversight or debate. The Japanese cities that were targeted for bat bomb attacks burned anyway. Different weapons, same outcome. The method of delivery doesn't change the fundamental reality. Fire kills, cities burn, civilians die. Project X-ray doesn't change what happened in World War II, but it reveals what almost happened. And in showing what almost happened, it raises questions about what's happening now in classified programs we won't learn about for decades. If stories like this fascinate you, the bizarre weapons, the secret programs, the innovation born from desperation, then you're in exactly the right place. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of War Rewind. We're uncovering the untold stories of World War II every day. The weapons you've never heard of, the tactics that sound impossible, the secrets that remained classified for decades.